Regulation, I guess, is not the most interesting of things to think about. However, perhaps in the context of this technology, because there are some properties that are extraordinarily unique that regulators are, well, having a hard time kind of trying to understand, and now the question of regulation becomes more interesting. So we got a great panel. Maybe we could do like a real quick round of introductions and kind of get things started. You want to kick us off?
Sure. My name is Eivind. I'm a tech lawyer working in the law firm Hjort in Oslo.
I'm Mariusz Nowostawski. I'm associate professor in NTNU.
My name is Jack DeRose. I'm one of the founders of a platform for decentralized autonomous organizations called Colony.
Vinay Gupta, originally with the Ethereum project and now with Consensus doing architecture and strategy.
Jesse Grushack, I'm with Consensus. I run the Ujo music project as well as business and strategy.
So maybe to get us kicked off, perhaps Vinay, if you could just, I don't know, just give us a high-level overview of how you see basically the blockchain and smart contracts and Ethereum kind of existing within the sort of legal framework that we currently have.
That'll be easy. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. So with all of this kind of stuff, the question usually with regulatory is who gets there first. So something like a smart contract could be seen as a financial instrument, it could be seen as a form of incorporation, it could be seen as a contract, and depending on how you perceive it, that will decide which branch of government comes along first and what questions they ask about the new instrument. So as things stand, I think that is changing from country to country to country. The countries that had more Bitcoin adoption tend to look at all this stuff as being currency, so they regulate as commodities. Once you make that decision, it's quite hard to then go back and say, actually, this is much closer to being an instrument in contract law. We need to use that as an approach. The EU obviously has a very large and sophisticated machinery for regulating digital stuff. Most of the time that machinery figures out what the industry consensus is and then follows it. Very rarely is it activist. Although in certain areas like privacy, it often takes quite a strong stance. So I would expect that the EU approach would be to try and wait as long as possible before identifying what a smart contract is or what a blockchain is. And then once they make a decision, they'll try and follow the industry norms as far as possible, with additional concern for things like consumer protection. So I think that in the EU case, we're going to see a sort of following regulation. So the state of the art will emerge and then they will tail. In the US, I think there's a substantial chance of what we will see is leading regulation, where the US has a vision of how they want this to fit into the industry, and then they regulate to try and create that vision. So I think we could see quite a strong EU-US split in the basic philosophy of regulation.
And maybe, kind of given that EU context or US context, maybe, Eivind, perhaps you could talk a bit about Norway specifically, and either the opportunity or potential threat to the technology here from the regulators.
Okay, is this on?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure that talking about regulating any specific technology makes any specific sense from a legal perspective. What the law has is a much more functional approach, and it's not, for example, you don't have the law relating to oil technology, you have the law of oil and gas. So law regulates the use of technology and not the technology itself usually. So you have to look at what you talk about when you talk about the Bitcoin or blockchain in this context. And the discussion has perhaps been somewhat stained by the Bitcoin uses for illicit markets and crime, which the governments are not happy about, obviously, and are unlikely to embrace in the future also. But so you have to be very specific what element and what kind of use of the technology are we talking about, and I think that's where the governments are going to hold back at the moment, and they're going to see how this goes, hopefully, and then they're going to see how this fits within existing regulation, and as always, the law will follow, it will not lead, I think. But obviously this technology is decentralized. It causes some problems to governments because law is territorial, and this could span across jurisdictions, and there's also obvious enforcement issues with anonymity and things like that. So Norway, I'm not sure if anyone has started thinking about this yet here, at least not politicians, but we're likely to follow the EU. I think anything else would be very unlikely, except perhaps in the criminal code sector. The EU and the US, I guess, have to find a global approach.
I guess with respect to use cases and sort of regulation being crafted according to the use of the technology, I'd just like to hear from Jack because he's got a very interesting project that, well, first of all, you should hear about, but secondly, thinking about it in the context of regulating for what you're doing is kind of interesting.
Yeah, so it's pretty difficult. Well, essentially what Colony is doing and what decentralized autonomous organizations or DAOs are doing in general is allowing organizations to be built on a blockchain without you necessarily being tied to a specific jurisdiction. And therein, obviously, you get all sorts of problems. You know, how do you deal with massively cross-border organizations wherein there is no, well, currently there is no actual legal structure that surrounds them. Rather, it's just hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of people participating in some activity, which looks, feels, tastes like a company, but actually isn't a company. So at the moment, what anybody who's doing stuff like that would be like an unincorporated association or a group of members, a partnership, and therefore would be jointly and severally liable, certainly under US law and probably UK law, for any of the activities undertaken by any of the other people in that de facto partnership. And you know, that's enormously problematic when you necessarily can't know who or indeed what the other participants are in the network. Some people may be going to great lengths to be anonymous or pseudonymous. Other people may be less sophisticated, and their data trail would be far more easily evidenced. So one of the challenges I think that we're going to see is how we deal with that, how we are able to create legal structures which can accommodate these kinds of organizations, which are, as I mentioned, cross borders and which have rapidly changing equity tables. And also how we treat the ownership of those things, because at the moment, people who are creating DAOs, and I don't know if you'll have heard of some of them, it's a very fine line between issuing a security and an unregulated stock, and not. Well, it appears that they are to me, certainly, but I'm not a lawyer. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that's dealt with.
Yeah, thank you for that. So basically, from a high-level perspective, on the blockchain, it now becomes very easy for people all over the world to come together, cooperate, form businesses, pay each other, engage in various business processes, etc. And so that becomes an extrajudicial question, I guess, because you don't need to necessarily incorporate in a jurisdiction to operate. You can do that online on the blockchain in a very transparent, secure way. And I'm just wondering, is Mariusz, with respect to the question of anonymity and ultimately privacy, I guess at times we hear this rhetoric that that's perhaps not something regulators want to see. But then there's a lot of internet freedom people that would suggest it's foundational that we have sort of anonymity and encryption and security, etc. I'm just wondering, perhaps if you could talk a bit about that and share some of your feelings, and particularly within the context of this discussion.
Yeah, thanks. So the interesting question here is that, for example, in the context of Bitcoin transactions, there is a movement to compliance, which means the KYC is sort of applied to Bitcoin transactions.
Sorry, KYC is know your customer. So before.
Yeah, if you imagine that going through, then you know the operators within the Bitcoin space will be compliant with the existing laws. But Bitcoin is not the only blockchain, and some chains allow total anonymity, where this kind of compliance mechanism wouldn't be applicable anymore. Therefore, we will have technology which allows anonymity and privacy. That's what we as academics strive for as well, which will challenge the legal systems in such a way that certain things will not be enforceable anymore. And the question is, will the regulations and mechanisms to prevent certain abuses, follow up, and how we will deal with that. The other point on the coin is that the regulatory mechanisms are good, but they may work against the basic freedoms that we already have. So if you imagine a central bank of Norway issuing their own krona as a digital token, right? And we, instead of using bitcoins, would use Norwegian krona in the same way, having the same benefits as we have currently with Bitcoin, with the Bitcoin pseudonymity that we have and the traceability that is in the chain. Then suddenly you go to a grocery shop, pay for your carrot, and it's trackable. Someone can track all your transactions, right? You don't have that violation of your privacy today. You can go to a market and pay with cash, and you retain your anonymity, right? Know your customers doesn't apply to all aspects of your life, applies only to some aspects of your life. So then certain regulatory mechanisms which will apply to the digital tokens that we will deal, in life may actually limit freedoms that you already have.
It's interesting to think about. And sorry, just in the interest of time, I just wanted to switch gears real quick to Jesse. Perhaps you could talk a bit about the music industry and maybe how something like Ujo is not only disruptive, but kind of also very constructive in that it sort of empowers the artists from end to end and in their interactions with listeners, with their customers.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I've spent the last probably couple months really diving into copyright law and trying to see if there, maybe you can avoid certain things or go around certain things. And, the laws are written into place and they, for the most part, do their job really well. So it's not about avoiding necessarily. I think it's working with them and helping make the systems more efficient. So, for example, the Copyright Office in the United States is totally manual, and they just recently enabled e-copyright. So you're now able to file online, which for the first time I think ever this year or last year, which is pretty insane. You're still filling out paperwork to kind of copyright music. But like as I said, it's about working with these companies and working with the governments to kind of create more efficient systems for copyright protection, for legalities, and for really kind of fitting into the current systems while making things more efficient and creating more value. And another kind of interesting thing I think that touches on the legalities is the codex, the language. I forgot who created it, but it's a solidity-based language, so it works with smart contracts, but it's based in law. Contracts, I believe they have a bunch of scripts that basically were written by lawyers and they kind of follow legal standpoints in the United States so that you can create applications that are compliant rather than totally defiant.
Cool. So just a few more minutes. I was thinking, Vinay, maybe kind of the dizzying pace of technology and how rapidly everything is moving, and basically our inability to understand, and then maybe like one last comment from everybody before we sign off.
So the regulatory landscape is, a relatively slow-moving environment. So things happen, something goes wrong, a couple of years pass, you get some regulation, you get a couple of years of negotiation with the industry about how the regulation will be enforced, you get a new status quo. Right now, this year, I think there are basically 5 or 6 technologies that are all at critical consumer adoption thresholds. So blockchains, AR, VR, drones, and sort of domestic robots are all right at the turning point of mass adoption. I think there are probably 5 commercial VR systems going in the market this year. The first wave of big Ethereum dApps are going online, and we expect some of those to be enormously successful. In that environment, it's not clear that the regulators have enough capacity to be able to get smart technical people to think through the issues, to write the regulations, to partner with the industry to get the regulations enforced and to act. So I think that we might see the beginnings of a breakdown in this whole regime and paradigm of regulation, simply because the technological change is going faster than the regulators can manage. And that suggests that we might wind up with self-regulatory frameworks of the type that apply in, say, maritime. So most of the stuff to do with ships and oil rigs and so on is extensively self-regulated because the stuff is so complex that you can't really rely on states to do it. It's also highly international. So right now I'm doing a little bit of research to figure out whether the regulatory frameworks around maritime could be brought over as templates for other kinds of advanced technology. And jury is still out on that, but that's the direction of travel that I'm currently looking at.
Cool. So maybe 30 seconds each. And Eivind, any final thoughts or takeaway thoughts?
Okay, yeah. Well, laws protect society and they protect third parties as well. So the fact that someone wants to do something on the blockchain doesn't mean it's legal or right. So you have to separate between legality and enforcement. And I think governments, they will continue to want tax. They will continue to want to control certain behavior. And how they do that is the big question going ahead. But I'm sure if the governments deem it necessary, they will regulate this technology or the application of it rather on some level.
Yeah, I want to repeat the word which was used before, self-regulation. I think that's the key for the technological kind of exploration of the space because it's not set in stone yet. It's kind of still evolving. The other point that I wanted to make is that there is an effort to standardize some of the security features of blockchains in general, and it may become a kind of an ISO effort. So it's kind of an interesting direction in regulating something, not in terms of regulation, but more of a certification level.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I agree with the self-regulation thing. Really, I think that with any new technologies, there's a tendency from some quarters to think that it's okay to say, well, this is different, therefore we don't need to abide by the rules anymore. We can do what we like, and I think that's a very, very dangerous game to play. I think that with any new technology, particularly ones like blockchain technology, which have such far-reaching potential applications, the people who are participating in the community around it need to be very sensitive to current laws and regulations if there is hope for a sort of regulatory light touch, which presumably is what we would like.
I think the light touch is extremely important. I'm reminded a bit of Ronald Reagan saying, if it moves, tax it. If it stops, subsidize it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. So the other way of handling this is obviously there's a kind of criminal branch of this, which is largely people breaking existing laws, and then there's a consumer protection branch, which is basically assuming that people could treat these new technologies with a certain amount of casualness and not lose their life savings in some scam. So I wonder what the role is for insurers as a substitute for regulators. That if we had comprehensive insurance for people operating in this kind of space, maybe a lot of the things which regulators would typically manage could be managed by the insurers. And that might give us some people that are extremely incentivized to stay on top of the technology and to act in a technologically sophisticated way, while providing the same kind of regulation, the same kind of protection that regulators might hope to. So I think that there's an optional path there that we could put the insurers in the hot seat and let them make big bucks in return for protecting the public.
Yeah, I'd agree with Vinay in the aspect of kind of looking forward, that it's more exciting to look forward at not necessarily regulation, but the new possibilities that are unlocked, and the new possibilities even with taxation. Silicon Valley likes to joke about crowdfunding taxes, or crowdfunding public works projects, and from a tax point, it's kind of funny, but it makes sense that you get to contribute to what you want, and maybe you hit a certain quota every year and you have to pay a certain amount, but you're paying towards things you believe in. And so these are kind of new paradigms that are really unlocked with blockchain technologies, and I think it's kind of going to be really exciting to see them moving forward.
Cool. Thank you very much. And on that note, it's worth mentioning that Ethereum is the most successfully crowdfunded project in history, given the scale of the network at this time and where it came from. And had there been mechanisms in place to ensure Ethereum never happened, well, we wouldn't be better off. So something to think about. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting idea, the fact that